Hello, my name is John Sabin. I'm one of the Great Lakes regional coordinators for Citizens Climate Lobby. I've also been a social worker for 30 years, mostly in the field of mental health as a psychotherapist, but I've also worked as a medical social worker in hospice and palliative care.
Hi, I'm Sarah Spence. I am the Director of Climate Programs for the Ohio Environmental Council. So thank you for joining our webinar today on climate advocacy at the local, state, and national level. Today's learning objective is going to be to identify and explain ongoing public health policy proposals meant to mitigate the adverse effects of climate change, discuss policy limitations, and unintended consequences. And so I'll just start a little bit by telling you guys about who we are at the Ohio Environmental Council. So the Ohio Environmental Council is a family of organizations. We have a traditional C3 educational organization. We have a C4 organization that allows us to do direct lobbying. And then we have a PAC that allows us to coordinate with candidates and a super PAC that allows us to do independent expenditure work. So what we do at the Ohio Environmental Council, we have 4 key areas of environmental policy that we focus on. And that's water, energy, public lands, and democracy. And so for our water work, we want to make sure that water is safe, clean, and affordable. For our energy work, we want to make sure that we are reducing carbon in our state's power sector. For public lands, we want to make sure that all Ohioans have access to outdoor green spaces where they can get away and enjoy recreation. And then for democracy work, we want to make sure that, in order to have a healthy environment, that we have a healthy democracy. And we do those work in those areas in 4 different ways. So we have an advocacy shop that works with legislators in creating policy. We have a communications team that really talks to the public about these important issues. We have regional directors that are throughout the state of Ohio connecting with locals on every level. And then we have a law center that helps communities when they're looking at rules or lawsuits around placement of energy projects or other issues that are going on in their areas. So I'll start by talking about local and state advocacy. That's kind of what we do at the Environmental Council. And so we'll start with the local level. So on the local level, local municipalities, counties, townships usually do their legislation through local ordinances. And there are several different ways that this can impact health. And so, one example that I like to use is right now we're working with a city on streamlining solar installation. And so this is going to allow their residents to be able to put rooftop solar on their houses, which reduces their energy bills, but also helps reduce the strain on the grid. And so if you're using less electricity from the grid, that's less coal and natural gas that they're burning. Zoning is also a very important issue. Zoning is the area of where you can have residential areas, commercial areas, industrial areas. And so we want to make sure that when cities are doing zoning codes, that they're looking at this as in an equitable way, and don't have their lower income or minority residents living next to coal-fired power plants or heavy industrial polluting sites. And then with the state of Ohio, a lot of the health issues actually go through local health departments. And so I think there are over 130 local health departments within the state of Ohio. And then for OEC, the biggest way that we actually advocate with locals is through the Power Clean Future Ohio campaign. And so we are working with cities across the state of Ohio to reduce their carbon emissions by 30% by 2030. And so cities are signing up to work with us. We're providing them technical expertise and some additional capacity in order to be able to implement carbon emission reduction solutions in an equitable way. And then on the state level, we advocate at the Ohio General Assembly. This is the legislative branch for the state of Ohio. The Ohio General Assembly is currently in the 133rd General Assembly. and that lasts through the end of this year. So there have been a lot of bills that get introduced into the Ohio General Assembly. The House right now is currently around 760 bills. The Senate is around 350 bills. And so there's definitely a lot of work that gets done at the General Assembly as far as legislation introduced. On the energy side of things, we have been working on some legislation around energy, electric vehicle infrastructure and incentives. We've also been working on bills that will repeal House Bill 6 from earlier in this General Assembly. As some of you may know, House Bill 6 passed last year, and it got rid of Ohio's clean energy standards, and is also bailing out 2 nuclear plants and then 2 coal-fired plants, one here in Ohio and the other in Indiana. And so that's definitely important legislation that we would like to see repealed and kind of reset the conversation on energy policy. On the water side, we have been working with General Assembly members. Legislation has been introduced that would require schools to have water dispensing stations in order for students to be able to fill up water bottles. We've been working with Representative Crawley and Representative Greenspan on a water affordability bill. We've been working with actually the General Assembly and the governor on a program that's called H2 Ohio, which is going to help reduce toxic algae within Lake Erie, reduce nutrient runoff that goes into Lake Erie. And then there are also bills that have been introduced on regulating PFAS and helping get lead service lines replaced. And so all of these bills have various different health impacts. And so as a physician, we really encourage you to get involved and be able to lend your voice into the health impacts that good legislation can have. And so just quickly, I'll talk through how a bill becomes a law in Ohio. And so, and this example is actually from the Ohio General Assembly, but it's very similar actually on both the local and state levels. And so usually it's either a legislator or, in the case of a local level, a city council member, becomes aware of either a need or a concern or a problem. And so then they draft a bill. So for the Ohio General Assembly, they contact an organization called the Legislative Service Commission, which is a nonpartisan organization of attorneys that help to make sure that bills are crafted in a way that currently match with the Ohio Revised Code and the Ohio Constitution. So then that bill draft is first filed with the chamber clerk, and it can start, a bill can start either in the House or in the Senate. And then it goes into a public hearing process. And so there are standing committees. And so, there are standing committees like Public Utilities or Health and Human Services. And so bills are kind of assigned to committees by their topic. And this is where the public can really get involved. They can go to hearings, they can testify for or against pieces of legislation. You can also submit written testimony if you're unable to testify in person. And this is a lot of times where bills can get either tweaked through amendments, or they could do really wholesale changes through substitute bills. Once the committee is satisfied with the work that they've done on the bill, then it goes to the full chamber for a debate and vote. And then if it passes the chamber, then it goes on to the other chamber. So if the bill started in the Senate, it will get passed to the House. If the bill started in the House, then it will go over to the Senate. And then that kind of public hearing process is repeated. And then once the second chamber votes on it, if they've made changes, concurrence might be needed between the two. And then once they get that worked out, it is sent to the governor for action. And the governor has 3 choices of action. The governor can sign the bill, can let the bill go into law without signing it. So if the governor does not sign it within 10 days, it automatically becomes law. Or the governor can veto the bill, which means he doesn't agree with it or she doesn't agree with it. And then the bill is then dead and does not go into effect. And so then I will pass it over to John to talk about federal advocacy.
Thank you, Sarah. Citizens Climate Lobby focuses almost entirely on federal legislation. Let me tell you a little bit about Citizens Climate Lobby. Citizens Climate Lobby is a volunteer-driven organization that focuses on empowering ordinary citizens to lobby government for climate change legislation. The basic approach of CCL is to be respectful and nonpartisan in the work that we do. We are working hard actually to build a bridge between the political left and right around climate change. We say we'd like climate change to be a bridge issue and not a wedge issue. We aim to have chapters of volunteers in every congressional district around the country, and then for each of those chapters to develop a friendly and respectful relationship with their own members of Congress, and then through those relationships to influence policymaking in Washington. We currently have chapters in something like 90% of congressional districts around the country. We do have chapters in every single district in Ohio. We say that we are laser focused on what we consider to be the first most important step in addressing climate change. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I want to emphasize now that when we say the first step, we mean not the last step and not the only step, but the first step. We focus, in order to accomplish this, on building what we call political will. Political will is what politicians respond to. And so we say that there are 5 levers of political will. And these are the 5 areas that we focus on in Citizens Climate Lobby. So first of all is direct lobbying. We schedule meetings with our members of Congress twice a year. Pre-pandemic, we would actually travel to Washington twice a year to meet with members of Congress or their staff. And we'd meet twice a year in the district with the staff. We also make regular phone calls and emails to those congressional offices. We work through the media. We write letters to the editor of local newspapers. We look to get interviews on radio and television, and we work through social media to get out our message and to keep climate change in the public conversation and climate solutions in the public conversation. We do grassroots outreach. We do presentations like this one, and pre-pandemic and hopefully post-pandemic, we do tabling events where we will have a table with literature and maybe letters for people to sign to Congress and recruit new volunteers that way. We do what we call grass tops outreach, where we engage business leaders and faith leaders and other community leaders to help amplify our message with Congress. And finally, we focus on chapter development, making sure that within each of our chapters, volunteers are getting educated about the issues, and also that we're building a supportive community of activists. This is hard work, and we need to support each other to be able to persevere through all of the difficulties and all of the setbacks that we face. Now, if we think about what makes a good climate solution, these are maybe 5 criteria that we might think about. One is, of course, it has to effectively drive down carbon emissions. And we say it also should not be harmful to low-income people. Low-income people already bear the burden of climate change impacts more than anyone else. And we want to make sure that solutions are not a further burden on these people. These first 2 points in CCL, we say these are our 2 red lines. When determining whether or not to support legislation, these are the 2 most important criteria. We also want legislation, ideally, that's durable across administrations. That means it has bipartisan support. We don't want to have legislation that's passed by one party only to see the other political party take it apart as soon as political power shifts in Washington. So this is tough work, but as I said, we work hard to build a bridge between the 2 parties on these issues. We also want solutions that are good for the economy as a whole. Too often we hear that we can't act on climate because it would harm the economy. That isn't necessarily true. And so we want to prove that that's not true and that we can address climate change while also benefiting the economy. And finally, climate change is a global problem that needs a global solution. So even if we pursue federal legislation, we need to keep global solutions in mind. So for many years, Citizens Climate Lobby has focused on what we call carbon fee and dividend as that first, most important step to take in solving climate change. This is a simple and elegant approach to climate change legislation. The idea is that you charge a steadily rising fee on greenhouse gas emissions at the source where those fossil fuels are first entering the marketplace. So at the oil well, or the mine head, or the port of entry. In the beginning, you charge a small fee so it does not shock the economy, but then that fee would rise steadily at a predictable and regular rate. So everyone in the economy knows that fossil fuels are becoming more expensive over time, and everyone has to plan ahead and develop access to clean energy. This is a way to incentivize the entire economy to move towards clean energy. There are many experts in the field who say that without this kind of price on greenhouse gas emissions, we cannot adequately address climate change. And it's based on a simple principle in economics that if you want people to do something less, you should make it more expensive. Now, what do you do with the money that you raise from this fee? In carbon fee and dividend, you return the money, 100% of the net revenue, to households in the form of equal monthly dividends. It turns out that when you give the money back equally to households, it has a progressive impact. That is, low-income families tend to come out ahead financially, and wealthier families tend to lose a little bit of money. But wealthier families are more able to adapt by buying electric vehicles, putting solar panels on their homes, and so forth. Finally, in order to make this type of legislation work, you need a border adjustment to maintain a level economic playing field internationally, and to make sure that you don't create some perverse incentive for companies to leave the United States and go to another country where they can pollute more freely. So if you put a tariff on goods from other countries that do not have a similar carbon price, you can accomplish this. The wonderful thing about doing this is that it means that countries that don't have a similar carbon price now have an incentive to do the same thing. So that by enacting this kind of legislation in one large economy like the United States, you create the motivation for the entire global economy to move in the same direction. In January 2019, there was an economist statement published in the Wall Street Journal that recommended carbon fee and dividend as the best approach for dealing with climate change. This letter has now been signed by over 3,500 economists, which is the largest public statement of economists in history. The signatories include 27 Nobel laureates, 4 former chairs of the Federal Reserve, 15 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors, and 2 former secretaries of the US Department of Treasury. That's James Baker and George Shultz, both of whom worked for Ronald Reagan. If you want to see that statement and want to learn more about who signed it, you can go to econstatement.org. I want to point out that these economists include liberal and conservative economists. So Citizens Climate Lobby has spoke to Congress for years about this idea of carbon fee and dividend. And then in late 2018, it was introduced as a piece of legislation with bipartisan support in both chambers of Congress. It was called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. Unfortunately, it was late in the congressional session, which means that the law expired, or the bills expired on December 31st, and had to be reintroduced in 2019. The bill was reintroduced in the House, but has not yet been reintroduced in the Senate. It currently has 82 co-sponsors, including Republican Francis Rooney of Florida. How does this bill work? It's very much along the lines of carbon fee and dividend as we had long lobbied Congress for. There's a fee on fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions at the source, $15 per ton of carbon emissions in the first year, going up by $10 per ton every year thereafter. $15 per ton translates to roughly an increase of 15 cents on a gallon of gas at the pump, and then another 10 cents every year after that. The revenue from this fee is returned 100% minus administrative costs to households as a monthly dividend. There is a carbon border adjustment, just as we talked about. And finally, once Congress got a hold of us, there was some congressional sausage making that was going on. And we had long said to Republican members of Congress in particular that we can address climate change without regulations by putting a price on carbon. And so Republicans wanted some guarantee that there would not be regulations on top of the fee. And so the bill says that the EPA cannot create new regulations of greenhouse gas emissions for 10 years. If at the 10-year mark, the emissions reductions that are specified in the bill are not being met, the EPA is then mandated to develop regulations to bring emissions in line with those emissions reductions targets. Citizens Climate Lobby is okay with this regulatory pause because we have always had confidence that the fee would be sufficient to bring down emissions, and we continue to have that confidence based on what the experts tell us. So you can see that this legislation does meet the 5 criteria that I laid out earlier. It reduces US emissions 90% by 2050. That's by statute that it meets that target. Of course, this is not all of what we need. We need 100% emissions reductions globally by that year. But if we can get this much emissions reductions in the United States with a single piece of legislation, that's not bad. Most low and middle income people gain financially. In fact, a recent study that was commissioned by Citizens Climate Lobby projects that 96% of the lowest income quintile will come out ahead financially with this legislation. This bill does have conservative and liberal support. Even though we only have one Republican who is currently sponsoring the bill in Washington, we know that conservatives around the country do support this legislation or this type of legislation. Some recent polling showed that something like 75% of young Republicans under the age of 40 support this type of legislation. So that we know that there is the potential anyway of bipartisan support in Washington, and we continue to work to make that a reality. Another study done by the REMI Group, that's Regional Economic Models, Inc., projects that this legislation will create 2.8 million new jobs over 20 years. So contrary to harming the economy, it would be good for the economy. And also through the border carbon adjustment, it does incentivize global cooperation. So it's not just a single country solution. It does move us towards a global solution. On the health front, as we know, climate change has many harmful impacts on people's health. But if we just look at health impacts from air pollution, the REMI report projects that this legislation will save nearly 300,000 lives in the first 10 years of implementation. And finally, although many approaches to climate change are quite expensive to implement, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act costs $0 in new spending in Washington. That's because the fee pays for the administrative costs. And those costs, by the way, are capped in the legislation at 8% of total revenue in the first 5 years, and then no more than 2% of total revenue in every year after that. So most of the money, as you can see, is returned to households, and the federal government does not need to come up with any new money to implement this. So we can get 90% emissions reductions spending $0 new dollars. What are we waiting for? If you want to read more about this legislation, you can go to energyinnovationact.org. And so now we'd like to talk a little bit about things that are similar in advocacy on any level. If you are planning to meet with your legislators, there are some things you want to do in advance. First of all, of course, you want to research the issues involved. If you're an ordinary citizen, you may need to educate yourself. Like I said, I'm a social worker by professional background, I became involved in CCL 4 years ago. I have no background in environmental science or environmental policy or economics or politics or any of the things that I, would want to know. And so I've had to learn. And that's true for any of us getting involved in this kind of work. You want to make yourself a subject expert for your legislators. That makes you a resource for them. So you don't just go in there as a, to give your legislators a hard time. You go to offer them advice as a subject expert, but you have to make yourself into a subject expert. You also want to research your legislators. You want to know things about them, where they went to school, what kind of interest they have, what kind of bills have they supported. You want to find common ground with them. And sometimes that common ground is as simple as, a university that you attended together, or maybe that you see legislation they supported that you can thank them for. Citizens Climate Lobby likes to always begin our meetings with legislators by saying thank you for something that they've done. You want to prepare a story. In CCL, we've been taught that there are two types of people who go into a lobby meeting. There are people with opinions, and there are people with stories. And people with stories are much more effective. So you want to think about how the issue at hand has affected you personally, or maybe it's affected someone that you know, because those stories are more compelling than simply a bunch of facts and figures. You also want to be prepared to ask very clearly for what you want. Maybe it's a specific piece of legislation that you want this legislator to support. So think about what you're asking for and be prepared to ask very clearly for that. And then you want to contact the office and find out how to schedule a meeting and go through those steps. You're muted, I think, Sarah, looks like.
Yeah, I got it.
There you are.
Yeah, so when you're meeting with legislators, so at the meeting, you want to do a brief introduction, just tell them who you are, maybe some of your credentials or why you're there. Make a connection with them. So as John had said, when you're researching, if there's a way that you can find something that either you have in common or a piece of legislation that you really like that they sponsored, be able to thank them for it, or be able to just say, hey, I went to the same school as you, or, my spouse went to the same university, something like that. During the meeting, you want to make sure that you're doing 50-50 talking to listening. And so just making sure that while you are giving your story, you want to also make sure that you're listening to what they have to say as well. And so then share your story. As John was saying, the people that come in with opinions or stories, and stories are more effective. But it's also kind of the same with facts, right? So I know as physicians, you guys have a lot of data, a lot of facts, a lot of numbers, a lot of science that you want to explain. And that is great, and you should absolutely do that. But if you can pair that with a story of something that you have either personally experienced as a physician, or that you've had a patient that you can just call a patient during that story, is definitely really effective for legislators. We've seen a lot of legislators who have been contacted by somebody who shared their story, and then they became their champion when it came to an issue. And so this is something that they can go back to their districts, and when they're on the floor, they're saying I am voting for this because of this person in my district, and this is how this is going to make their life better. And so being able to kind of connect on that human level of a story is very important. And then you want to make your ask. So, will you please support bill whatever number? Or will you please vote against bill whatever number? So make sure that your ask is clear, so that you know what you're actually asking for. And then this is important. Once you make that ask, give them space to answer. So I know sometimes we can be nervous, and you make your ask and then you just start continuing talking. Actually stop for a second and let them respond first. So this way you can actually, know where they stand. And if you have questions, it is, perfectly reasonable to ask, can you explain that? Why you feel that way. but you definitely at least want to give them space to answer from your ask. And then when the meeting is over, make sure to thank them for their time. Legislators are really busy. I know physicians are really busy as well. But being able to take some of their time to talk about your issue, just make sure that you show them appreciation for that. And then there are other ways that you can communicate. So if you cannot get a meeting scheduled, you can always send them a letter or an email. So again, make it personal, share your story, try to keep it to 500 words or less. They do get a lot of emails and mail every day. Make sure you include your contact information. And this just helps offices, especially if you're contacting your own legislator. They tend to put priority on pieces of mail or emails that come from their actual constituents within their districts. You can also give them a phone call. Be courteous, expect to talk to a staffer. A lot of these offices, especially on the local and state levels, may only have 1 or 2 staff people. And so they're usually the ones who are answering the phones, but also have a short voicemail prepared. So usually just, your name, why you're calling, the piece of legislation you're calling about, whether please consider voting for or against this piece of legislation, and then leaving your contact information. Those are good things to have prepared when you leave the voicemail. And again, because most of these offices have only a couple of staff people, sometimes they're already on the phone with other constituents, or maybe they're out of the office in a committee hearing. So just having that thing already prepared will be helpful.
In the wake of the HB6 scandal here in Ohio, Sarah and I and the representatives from some other environmental groups around Ohio have been talking about what might be a good framework for Ohio energy policy going forward. What might be the principles that should undergird any new policy here? And so this is really just a working document, but these are some of the things that we've been talking about with each other, that we'd like to see Ohio energy policy move towards net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. And we'd like any new energy policy to be protective of low-income people. As I said, it's low-income people who often bear the brunt of climate change in the first place, or energy production. Like Sarah talked about, coal-fired power plants, often in low-income neighborhoods. And we'd like to see energy policy that protects low-income people instead of putting them more into harm's way.
And then also transition for workers who may be displaced. Especially where I grew up in southeastern Ohio, there are a lot of communities who have built their economy, and a lot of workers who have built their careers in the fossil fuel industry, whether that be in coal mining or natural gas production. And so these workers will most likely end up being displaced as we transition to cleaner energy sources. And so being able to have a way to transition these workers from those good paying jobs into other good paying jobs that are still going to be able to support their families, that's something that's very important. And then also assistance to frontline communities. These are the people and places that are the most impacted by climate change. So in Ohio, the populations that we see most impacted by climate change are usually those are of low income. They are communities of color that have been either zoned into or somehow placed near industrial sites, or more towards heavy polluting factories or coal-fired plants, natural gas plants, those kind of areas. And these are the ones that have the most health impacts as well, right? So they're breathing in air that is, that has pollutants. And so you can see in Cincinnati and Cleveland areas of low-income areas or minority areas where they have higher asthma rates than either the rest of the city and definitely the rest of the state as a whole. And so these are the communities that we want to be able to lift up and assist because they are going to need more assistance because they have been more impacted by climate change. Another group that has been really impacted by climate change that people may not think of is Ohio's farmers. With the change in weather from having heavy rains that are like unanticipated to then going through and having more 90-degree days that's causing droughts. So that is something that we also want to take a look at as well. And so if you have any questions of me, of any local policy or state policies that are going on, or how you'd like to get more plugged in and involved in advocacy on a state or local level, here's my contact information, and please feel free to reach out.
And if you would like to learn more about Citizens Climate Lobby or volunteer with us, you can go to our website at citizensclimatelobby.org. You can read about us there, you can join us there, or if you just can't wait to be a volunteer, you can text the word join to 619-675-7507. My contact information is here. You can write to me at john.sabin@citizensclimate.org. I'd love to take your questions there. And here are some resources for further study. These relate to various things that Sarah and I have spoken about today. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And Sarah and I will both be part of the live Q&A panel on Friday, October 23rd at 5:30. So look forward to seeing you there.